Welcome to Prajna Sparks, a podcast where we listen to a dharma teaching, contemplate through conversation and song, and engage in guided meditation. Today, Lama Yeshe teaches about listening, contemplation, and meditation, the foundations of integrative practice, and you learn why the podcast is called Prajna Sparks.
Lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, which is what I follow and know a little bit of. I don't know a whole lot about the other traditions. There's a really broad band of focus in how we work with the Buddha Dharma. There is, of course, meditation in the generally understood way of things, where we're sitting and calming the mind. Then there are investigative kinds of meditation that involve examining the mind in different ways that progress through a spectrum of experiential inquiry in the Mahamudra tradition. Mahamudra is a major focus of the Kagyu lineage. And then there are also Vajrayana practices, very elaborate practices using meditational deities and ritual in an extremely intimate, immediate approach to gaining understanding and unveiling the natural qualities of mind. All of these approaches have as a starting point the idea of Tathagarbha, or a Buddha nature. Buddha nature is a central theme in the Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. It's the premise that wherever there is mind, the nature of that mind is itself Buddhahood, and that the point of spiritual practice is to reveal that nature in its full glory. What's obstructing that nature are literally called obstructions from karma and kleshas. Those are two Sanskrit words meaning action and basically affliction or disturbing emotion, as well as cognitive obscurations, basically just not knowing or misknowing the way things really are. So the point of practice is to release that Buddha nature from the two major obscurations, the klesha and cognitive obscurations, or emotional and intellectual obscurations. And all of these forms of practice are integral in doing that. There are many different ways of practicing because there are many different people with many different predispositions, many different interests, many different strengths. And the idea is basically to throw everything possible out there so that each individual will find an approach that resonates for them and that works well for their progress. But one style of practice is almost omnipresent throughout all these different styles. It's something that's central to the Tibetan Buddhist monastic scholarly tradition. Monks and nuns in Tibetan Buddhist monasteries from the very start of the lineages and to the present day engage in very rigorous scholarly inquiry. Lots of study, lots of analysis, lots of meditation in a different sense than is the usual picture of a serene person sitting cross-legged on a mountaintop somewhere. And that style of practice involves a threefold process called listening, contemplating, and meditating in Tibetan, Tusam Gomsum, the triad or trio of listening, contemplating, and meditating. I call this threefold process integrative practice because it's the way that the Buddha taught us to integrate the Dharma. And it's a style of practice that I think is unusually suited to Western practitioners. The typical Westerner, however minimal their education, however unintellectual they take themselves to be, will often be a lot more acclimated to academic study than some of the traditional practitioners in a monastic college setting in ancient Tibet, for example. So this process, which is very analytical and very experiential, takes a strength of the Western intellectual capacity and also a longing for bringing the Dharma into our experience, which I hear all the time in all of the various centers that I go to. This practice is actually unusually one that is enduring through lineages. We see the Buddha in the Pali Suttas talking about the process of listening, contemplating, and meditating, together with the prajna, or precise knowledge that comes from these, in the very earliest of the Buddhist teachings. And it goes on through all the traditions of Buddhism, and we find it in Tibetan Buddhism practice in a very live fashion to this day. So what exactly is it? What is this integrative practice? Each one of these is a piece that you could spend hours on, because it's a very live practice. It's a very diverse practice, and it's very individualized. That's one of the things I really love about this practice, how diverse it is. It's also very natural. We do this kind of thing all the time in our everyday life. We call it study or research or any number of generic terms, but the aspects of listening and contemplating and meditating that we use in the Dharma context are not alien to us. They're actually quite familiar. So using them as instruments for contemplative inquiry is actually a fairly simple process. It's fairly easy to transition to using them in this way, because we're actually fairly familiar with the building blocks. Listening is really about input. At the time of the Buddha, there was no tradition of writing down teachings as we do today. Almost anybody listening to a Dharma teaching today is busily scribbling notes, and we're a much more literate culture than in the past. And actually at the time of the Buddha, it was considered taboo to write scriptures, to write down spiritual teachings. In the Brahmanic traditions of his day, it was actually considered impure. So Brahmin priests, for example, in the India contemporary to the Buddha, would need to purify themselves after writing scripture before actually engaging in ritual. It was considered a taboo thing to do. So it's called listening because that was the main way that teachings were input. And when we look at the original suttas of the Buddha that were first committed to writing some 5 centuries or so after his passing, there's a lot of repetition in the suttas because that was the best way to remember them. They were really committed to memory, and this is a really essential part of this listening piece. Nowadays, folks are not really excited about the prospect of memorizing just about anything except for jingles and things that somehow get into our brains through earworms and then just never get out of there. But the idea of listening is really focused on that sense of memorizing, hearing them so many times that they just jump to the mind. There's a sense of understanding the terms, which is a key part of listening. It's a semantic knowledge that comes from this. We understand the individual words and the way they were meant in the context of the teaching. This is another really critical piece about integrative practice. It is extremely contextual. The same term will mean different things philosophically in different traditions of Buddhism. Even within Tibetan Buddhism, the same term may have different philosophical senses in different lineages. So listening is about being attentive, being retentive, and also being very precise. There's lots we could say about how to listen, but that gives us a a big introduction for what listening is about. And we'll explore each of these in more detail as we go on. But this first part is really about input. I love to think of integrative practice in the context of something we all love to do, eating food. Dharma listening is like ingesting. We take a delicious meal, and the first thing we do is we put it in our mouth. As soon as it's in our mouth, the saliva is starting to break down the nutrients. Of course, it doesn't break them down to the point that you can inject it right into our cells and have it be useful, but there's already a process of developing towards integration happening. That's what's happening during the listening. We're getting very precise about what the words mean in a way that is attentive and also retentive. We're really holding on to the sense of things. To the extent that things slip out, we go back and we refresh our understanding. So that's the listening piece. And as we go through this, I'm talking about it as if it was very linear, but we're going to start to see how they each all feed back on one another continually. It's a multi-dimensional, multi-temporal process that doesn't occur in a straight linear progression, but is explained in that way because it's easier to understand. So once we have a sense of listening, so for example, we might hear the term integrative practice, or the Tibetan term Chusam Gom Sum, or the translation of that, the triad of listening, contemplating, and meditating. And the first time we hear it, we're like, I understand those words. I know what the word listening means. I know what the word contemplating means. I know what the word meditating means. But that's not very precise yet. We know what it means very generally. And even if we go into a Merriam-Webster or other English dictionary, we will find a gazillion definitions for each of those terms. So now we're going to start honing in what exactly is meant by the particular term in the particular setting. That's how we're developing the prajna that comes from listening. Prajna is a Sanskrit word also. It means precise knowledge, roughly. And it means knowledge that is very particularized, that's very contextualized and very precise for that context. So each of these steps, listening, contemplating, and meditating, develops a prajna, a kind of knowing, a precise knowing. The prajna that comes from listening is basically semantic knowing, being very clear about the meaning of the terms in the context of the particular teaching. That's what comes about through the attentiveness. The retentiveness is what allows us to always remain within the scope of that intended meaning. That prajna, that semantic precise knowing, is what we take into the next stage, contemplation. Contemplation means reflecting on the meaning of the terms, reflecting on that semantic knowing in a very precise way. This is actually my favorite of the three, if I had to say there was one. And why is that? Because it's the most multifaceted. Listening to a podcast can be listening. What we're going to do shortly is already the beginning of contemplating, discussing with one another what we heard is a way of contemplating. We're sharpening the prajna that comes from listening, that semantic knowing, into an even more precise prajna, the prajna that comes from contemplating, which is basically an intellectual style of knowing. It's an intellectual understanding. And contemplation can be discussing with one another. It can be reflecting on what we heard in the teaching and making sure we understand it. It might be writing out all of the different meanings of the word that we heard. It might be any kind of creative, individual ways that we have to engage the teachings on a personal level. This can also be something that happens as we go about our day. It might be something that we do on a meditation cushion in a very focused way. But a lot of the times this contemplation opens a space of inquiry in our mind where we find that even as we go about the day, we're driving or washing dishes or vacuuming or taking care of the kids or whatever it may be, little bursts of insights start to come to the surface. This is prajna rising to the surface in a very immediate way. Contemplation is really about starting to take that semantic knowledge, which is rather dry, and starting to mix it with the moisture of our own experience, our own knowing, our own lives. Contemplation also starts to bridge into the third piece. So contemplation can be a very active style of contemplation like we're talking about, and it really can be anything. It can be done through journaling, it can be done through art, it can be done through music, through discussion, through a personal self-reflection in the active form. And then in its more meditative form, we're actually on the meditation cushion, and we might even have created a list of points on the particular topic we're listening and contemplating. In our case, we're listening and contemplating about integrative practice right now. So we might actually go to the cushion and say, do I understand what the listening part is? Do I understand what the contemplating part is? What is that precise knowing that is particular to contemplation, that intellectual understanding? As we do that on the meditation cushion in a formal style of contemplation, we start to shift into the third of these, the meditation. This meditation is not exactly the same style of meditation that we're used to. It's often called shamatha, or in Sanskrit, tranquility meditation or calm abiding meditation. This is the standard foundational style of meditation for all Buddhist practice. The style where we are calming our mind to a very concentrated, clear state. This forms the basis of the meditation phase of integrative practice, but that's not all the meditation phase is about. The meditation phase is actually a balance, an alternation between contemplation and meditation. So the contemplation takes up where the active contemplation leaves off. We have that intellectual understanding of whatever we've listened to and contemplated. And at some point we have a sense of, oh, I understand that. I get it. It might seem like a just sense of solid knowing and grounding. It might, if it's something that we've struggled with, we might suddenly get an insight that feels like a eureka moment or a light bulb going off, or oh, I got it, an epiphany of sorts. This is what comes about when we're doing that formal style of contemplation. The first time we do it, it may take some time. It's massaging. It's like the food example where now it's in the stomach. The food gets down to the stomach and we're digesting it. It's a lot more aggressive than the saliva in our mouth processing the food. Now we're really getting down to a more usable bits of information. So in the meditative phase, we're actually first doing analytical meditation, which is very much like the contemplation, but we're using that knowing that comes from the contemplation. In the contemplation phase, we were contemplating the knowing that came from listening, semantic knowing. In the analytical meditation phase, we're using the prajna, the precise knowing that comes from contemplation and intellectual understanding. So what we do is we take that contemplation and we basically say, okay, I understand what it's saying. At this point, you're not saying, oh, I agree with everything the Buddha says. You're just very clear that you have an accurate understanding of what is meant in the teaching, whatever it may be. And then we use that view to dialogue with our own view. You say, well, how do I experience this? Is this really how I see it? If it's not how I see it, what do I think about it? And we go back and forth. It's almost like we're on a witness stand and the Buddha's advocate is questioning our view against the view of the Buddha. And there's the one difference is that it is not adversarial. It's very much a back and forth. And you see this very vividly and very beautifully in the Tibetan style of debate, which is very physical and can seem very aggressive, but is actually just a really powerful way of putting ourselves and our views to the test for ourselves. This is all happening interiorly. It's an inner dialogue that we're having with the Buddha's teaching. It's a way that we actually dialogue directly with the Buddha, directly with whatever master of the teaching we may be encountering with. And it's incredibly poignant. It's also a way that we contact the natural world and the experiences around us in an immediate way. The Dharma isn't just about some faraway time in the future, it's about here and now. The Buddha famously talked about how the Dharma changes our life here and now, as well as down the road. So what happens in that contemplation, again, is very rich, very personal, very individual. We're really dialoguing with the Buddha's teachings. Some of it might be that we realize, oh, I really thought I agreed with this topic, say karma, for example. But what I think of as karma is very different than what is it being explained in the Buddha's teachings. Or we might say, oh, I don't agree with this altogether. And I'm not entirely sure I can even have this conversation with the Buddha. And that's fine. There's no requirement to do this. But that very sense of, I'm not ready for this right now, is itself a precise knowing. What comes out of that analytical meditation is a sharpened form of precise knowledge. It's that very immediate, visceral sense that's like, it's more than a eureka, more than a light bulb. It's the living of that eureka. For example, a lot of Buddhist meditations are about meditating on our own mortality. It's got that, if we're meditating on the time of death, who doesn't know that we're going to die? Everybody knows this. But do we live like we're going to die? Do we live every moment like we know we're going to die? Listening to the teachings on death gives us a sense of semantic, precise knowing of what the Buddha means by that mortality and everything surrounding it. Contemplation gives us an intellectual understanding of the various points that we can use to get closer and closer and closer to that experience that is so vulnerable that most of us don't go there. The analytical stage of the meditation is where we actually go there, where we actually put ourselves through various different methods that a lot of the times you work with a teacher or with a text, to get us to that visceral sense. It's that same visceral sense that you get if somebody cuts you off on the highway and you think, oh my gosh, I could have died. That same kind of powerful visceral sense. Now, with death, that sense can feel like fear or panic. With less emotional topics in the Dharma, it may not have that same valence. It may have a different kind of visceral sense. It can feel like warmth. It can feel like light. But there is almost always an embodied feeling, an embodied sense that goes with this, a felt sense that gives us that visceral aha, that visceral epiphany. That epiphany that cuts through superimposition. Superimposition is an important word in this tradition. It means taking something to be other than it actually is, putting a conceptual overlay on something that covers up how it actually is. The prajna, the precise knowing that comes from meditation, cuts through superimposition, cuts through the veils that cover up how things actually are in a very sharp and immediate way. In the analytical phase, that comes up in what is called Yeshe in Tibetan. Literally, it means definite knowing. It's a clear knowing. It's that sense of epiphany, aha, eureka, that is a felt sense. As soon as that comes up, we stop the analysis. And that experience becomes the object of our meditation Just as in regular shamatha practice, it's very common, for example, in shamatha or tranquility meditation to use the breath as the object of meditation. And we stay with that breath as long as possible without distraction outward, which is agitation, or caving inward, which is dullness. In this resting phase of the meditation, we take that clear knowing that came out of the analytical part of the meditation, and we use that as the meditation object, similar to what we would do with the breath in standard shamatha practice. We stay with that clear knowing, with that immediate experience of clear knowing, as long as we're able, without distraction outwardly or inwardly. At first, when we're doing this practice, we're not able to stay with that very long. So when we catch ourselves getting distracted, unlike shamatha, where you usually just go back to the object, first we have to find our object again, because here in this practice, when we get distracted, that means that we're no longer with that real sharp, immediate sense of clear knowing. So we go back to the analytical meditation and really stoke that clear knowing again until it feels very immediate, and rest in that. So the meditation part of listening, contemplating, and meditating is that dance between analysis and rest, analysis and rest. It's an active and repose flux, almost like a heartbeat, a systole and diastole of beat and pause, beat and pause. Early on, when we first start working with a topic, we will probably spend a lot more time on the analysis phase of the meditation than the resting phase. The other thing about this is that the resting phase does sort of assume that we have a decent basis in shamatha practice, the ability to rest with a meditation object. So that is a practice that we do in addition to this integrative practice. Like in every other Buddhist practice, shamatha is the basis. So that gives us a sense of the listening, contemplating, and meditating. Well, what does it do? What this is doing is the prajna that comes out of meditation is a meditative knowing. It's like the food has already been digested in the stomach, and it is down to the building blocks, the actual energetic material that can now go into the cells and be integrated into the body, assimilated into the body, and used for the energy and purposes of the body. So it is that meditative knowing that starts to shift our view about the world, about ourselves, about what is apparent and what is genuine. It becomes our new operating system. That's another way to think about integrative practice. Actually finding information, identifying that it's what we want, and then downloading it so that we can actually use it. In any of the ways that you exemplify integrative practice, what is going on here is we're taking Dharma teachings that are out there somewhere, and we're making them the core of our view. Integrating them means bringing them inward, bringing them inside, which I always find very poignant. The Tibetan word for a Buddhist is nangpa, which means inwarder, one who looks within for the answers, for the questions even. And that's what integrative practice does. It helps us to turn inwards, to modify our misconceptions about reality, and to engage in a living, magnificent dialogue with the Buddha on an ongoing basis, so that we can look at the difficulties in the world, mortality in the time of a pandemic, equality in the time of Black Lives Matter, hatred in the time of brutality, and look at them through the very expansive panoramic view of the Dharma that is free of the self-clinging and self-importance that can make our views into actually toxic style of beliefs, rather than the expansive wisdom and compassion that is central to the Dharma. So that's it. That's why I love integrative practice. It's also content neutral. It applies to any dharma that you're working with. So it's a style of practice that you can learn and apply to whatever dharma is immediate and present for you right here and now.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like that I can listen to this recording again. In fact, I did. And that was really helpful because I knew that the first time when I was hearing you do the teaching, I was like, oh, I know I missed something. And so I was able to go back and make sure that I got that fully. And so that's wonderfully helpful for listening. And you talked about how, listening, you're already starting to do the contemplation. And I love also how you talked about the variety of ways that people can contemplate. Uh, you know that I have a certain way of doing things because I have a quirky muse. And so when I reflect on the teachings, I often end up making up songs. And you have encouraged this. I remember it started when you were studying at Pulahari Monastery in Nepal, and I came for a 10-day meditation retreat. And it turns out that if I am being silent for 10 days, then I end up writing a lot of songs. And I don't write the melodies. I borrow them from, pop songs and musicals and Christmas carols. And so they lend themselves well to karaoke, which is great. But I end up singing them to myself or to the grandbaby. And so I return to the teachings again and again, which is lovely. And you recently had me share a song I wrote in a virtual retreat you did recently, which was the impetus for this podcast. I wanted to hear more of your teachings, and I wanted to get more people to hear your teachings, and I wanted to write songs about your teachings. So here we are. But I feel like it's really the contemplation that brought us here, brought me to that vision of wanting to have more opportunity to hear your teachings and to reflect on them through song.
Yeah, that's the contemplation in many ways is the most diverse and the broadest. The reason we have integrative practice is obviously to integrate the Dharma teachings, to basically start having that be the view that is our operating system. The first of the eightfold path that the Buddha lays out for enlightenment, the first branch, the first step, you might say, is right view. So integrative practice is really a way of not just understanding the view so you can answer questions on a multiple choice exam, but so that it's actually what you've are operating out of. It's actually informing your conduct. And the way we do that is through this process of listening, contemplating, and meditating. The contemplating is in some ways the most creative, the most extensive. The point of all of it is the ultimate prajna, or knowledge that comes from meditation. That's why we do the practice. That is the integrated view. But where does that come from? To do the meditation, we need the prajna that comes from contemplation, that intellectual knowledge. And that comes from the semantic knowledge of listening. So that contemplation is really like the bridge. It's the thing that takes the Dharma from the page or the lips of a teacher or a screen or whatever it may be, and really makes it into the building blocks, the digestible material that we use in the meditation practice, which is more structured. But the contemplation is where we let ourselves go. Just like you're saying, we are able to really encounter it in our experience. And we do that in any number of ways. You have this thing for making song lyrics. So that's a beautiful way. It's not just the song lyrics. As you know, the process of really thinking about the Dharma and you're basically doing exactly what contemplating is. You're trying to condense it into pieces that you can chew on again and again, that you can really digest. This is a digesting piece. And then once you have a particular way of having a product out of it, there's lots of other things people can do. People can debate. Tibetan Buddhism is very famous for its very elaborate forms of monastic debate, where there's lots of shouting and clapping of hands. And it's a very physical kind of contemplation, which we normally don't think of about contemplation. And then contemplation can happen as we're going about our day, just like what we normally would call thinking or pondering or reflecting. And then there's the more structured piece that happens as the first phase of the meditation. But the critical part with the contemplation is not even the modes that we use. We could do anything. We could journal. We could review our notes. We can make outlines. We can talk to somebody. We can talk out loud. We can try to do the teaching ourselves. How much did I actually digest of this? That's a beautiful way of finding the spots. But what I really love about contemplation is that sense of sacred space. So I specifically choose this word contemplate because in English it means with the temple, within the space that is bounded by an augur, literally, someone who is actually in charge of creating sacred space. So what we're doing when we contemplate is we're creating that sacred place for ourselves. And it's beautiful for it to be a reflection of who we are, the people that we choose to talk to, that we can interact with in our Dharma center or through our personal relationships, our individual gifts of songwriting or art. Art is another beautiful way of doing it. It's really a way of our starting to bring it into our experience. And then it continues forward as we go into the analytical phase of the meditation. But what happens in the contemplation, whatever mode we use, is we're actually developing intellectual knowledge. Another way of thinking about it in non-spiritual contexts is we're studying. It doesn't sound as exciting, but this is a kind of study that is experiential instead of entirely in our heads.
So this is one of the reasons I wanted to get to have these conversations with you, because you completely blow my mind when you talk about some of these things like contemplate. It's like contemple, it's within the temple. And so that's just such a striking way of thinking about it and using the words to really develop that understanding. So thank you. I feel like that's just a wonderful gem that you shared. So that's great.
I'm glad you like that.
Yeah, I
love it myself, if I have to admit.
And I love the piece about thinking about it as studying, because so I'm a professor, and when my graduate students are preparing for their qualifying exams, then I always suggest that they don't just read over the material, but they do something with it, you know, whether it's teaching it to other people or make a PowerPoint or, you know, something, make flashcards or outlines, but do something with it to kind of make it your own in a way to really integrate that knowledge. So it sounds like that there's a parallel there.
Very much so. I mean, traditionally it would have been memorizing, and there's still a lot of memorizing that happens in this tradition. If that's something that's good for you, that's great. If you want to write poetry or verse, that's great. If you want to just journaling with Dharma work is a fabulous thing to do, because it's not just study, it's experiential study. You're putting your own experience into it. So it might be something like journaling about, well, how does this particular topic relate to my life? How does it interact with things that are happening around me in my world, in my family, etc. And it really becomes very potent.
Yeah, I was really struck by, you talked about it was taboo to write scripture. And, you know, that's why teachings were spoken. And I always find it challenging to try to say anything about the Dharma, because it always just seems too deep and complex and meaningful for me to try to say anything about. But for some reason, the songwriting is easy. And so I think that's where, if there's something that that's easy for a way to digest it. So journaling, you know, maybe for some people, like you were talking about, but whatever it is, just finding the thing that fits.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're hitting on is, again, goes back to why I like to use that term contemplate. In Dharma, boundary is very important. Actually, I'm very fond of explaining to people that the word that's translated as retreat in English, in Tibetan literally means boundary, like boundaries between two states or something like that. So what contemplation does in this sense is it's creating a boundary, a space that is structured by the actual teaching. So it's actually easier to work with it with the structure. The structure actually becomes freeing, ironically, because you're not trying to remember all of what was that and what was this. The pieces of the teaching are the structure, the boundaries. And then within that structure, you have all the freedom you want to dance, to sing songs, to do art, to make poetry, to journal. And that expression is always bounded. It makes it very easy because the structure of the material, the prajna that came from listening, the semantic knowledge, forms the forum, the arena for the contemplating. And that actually narrows the field to the point where it's a little bit easier. Otherwise, dharma is immense and it's easy to get lost the way you're describing, where it's very hard to really be sure of what you're talking about. This approach really just narrows it to the particular topic. And as we go on with the podcast, we'll see how that works. And then that actually brings more freedom and more ability to interact freely.
Great. So one thing I would love for you to do as we end our conversation today is, so the name of this podcast is Prajna Sparks. Can you talk a little bit about the meaning of the name?
Yeah, well, Lama Zopa and I have a group called Prajna Fire. And so, of course, Sparks has to do with fire, but why fire? What does fire have to do with any of this? Well, when we think about integrative practice, think about what we're ultimately trying to do. It's always good with the Dharma to go back to first principles. What is the Buddha trying to do with all of these teachings? He's trying to cut through the very root of this cycle of existing, of constant rebirth, aging, illness, death, rebirth, aging, illness, death. So how do we do that? He identifies the knowledge of realizing the true nature of things, specifically the non-self nature of individuals and phenomena. In this tradition, that's how we describe that, as the antidote to ignorance that keeps us cycling in samsara. But how do we do that? The condition we're in is operating under this cloak of not knowing the true nature. So how do we use our knowledge, which is tainted by that, colored by that, to transcend that? How do we do that? There's a gap between our very dualistic, self-oriented way of experiencing the world and this non-self, that knowledge that transcends samsara. So how do we do that? We do it by listening, contemplating, and meditating. Each of those steps generates a prajna, the semantic knowledge that comes from listening, the intellectual knowledge that comes from contemplating, and this deep meditative knowledge that comes from meditation. That knowledge, of course, at first is small. But what it's trying to do is it's acting as an antidote to ignorance. So the example is that it's like one stick and ignorance is like the second stick. And we're rubbing our knowledge against our ignorance. In that part where we're doing the analytical meditation, first we contemplate until we get this sense of clear knowing. That's those two sticks rubbing together. It's that sense of taking the knowledge that came from listening and contemplating and rubbing it against the stick of our own mistaken ways of experiencing the world, not knowing what the world is. What happens when we rub two sticks together? Fire. In this situation, it is prajna fire, the fire that becomes so intense through our practice over time that it burns through not only ignorance, but even this knowledge itself, which is also dualistic. So it gets to that point where this prajna fire burns through even dualistic knowledge. Nothing is left. The only thing remaining is that pure non-dual jhana, wisdom, Yeshe. A perfect English word for it would be gnosis. And that's why in this podcast, we're working with the sparks that come off of that fire so that we can work with it more deeply in our individual practice until we have a direct experience of the true nature of things.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Lama Yeshe and Tania Israel. Next, you'll hear Heather Stevenson with a song, and then Lama Zopa offering a guided meditation. Shivnee Ratna is our Tibetan singing bowl artist. Thanks for listening. May all beings benefit.
Prajna Sparks, Prajna Sparks, wisdom arising from practice. Listen then, contemplate, meditate, bring it inward. Buddha nature fully manifest when obstructions are burned through. Prajna Sparks, Prajna Sparks, nourish the fire within you. Buddha nature fully manifest when obstructions are burned through. Prajna Sparks, Prajna Sparks, nourish the fire within you.
To begin our meditation, first just take a seated position that feels comfortable to you. Traditionally, there are different points of the meditation posture that are supportive to a calm, stable, and alert mind. Usually amongst all of them, one of the most centrally important is just having an erect spine, something where you can feel both grounded through your seat connected to the earth, as well as uplifted from the crown of your head. So that sense of both groundedness and upliftedness, that energetic resting or engagement that is so central to meditation. So take a moment just to settle in, become aware of your body, become aware of your breath, of whatever emotions or thoughts that are going on in your mind, and just let them flow. Pay gentle, kind attention to them without seizing on anyone or trying to push any away. Next, we'll just take a couple of breaths to ground, to arrive fully present with wherever we are in our day, with wherever we are in our minds, allowing it all. So let's take 3 breaths to come settle here now. As we begin our meditation, one of the most important aspects is just the attitude that we take towards the meditation. if we can have a sense of curiosity, of playfulness, of experimentation, of really wanting to discover what our mind is like, this is incredible aid to the lengths to which we go in our meditation, to how far we can take it. For today's meditation, we'll be focusing on shamatha, that foundational meditation, which is the basis for being able to stay with the clear knowing that we generate through our contemplation and analytical meditation. So for shamatha, we can just think about it as finding that balance point between our the lucidity of our minds, the knowing aspect of our mind, and the resting aspect. It's continually tuning that dial where we're neither distracted nor dull. We're able to remain on the focal referent that we've chosen. In this case, we'll work with our breath. So as the breath leaves our body on the exhalation and comes back in on the inhalation, we just pay attention to it. We let that be the anchor for our meditation. And whatever thoughts that might come into mind, we don't push them away. We don't try to stop them, but we also don't get engaged with them. And anytime we do get engaged, we just allow ourselves to return back to the breath. Notice the breath and settle back into that. So if you would like to, for this recording, we'll just do that for 1.5 minutes. But if you have more time, I strongly encourage you to pause the recording and take however much time you can to do this, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, however long. Let the breath flow freely. Don't try to adjust it. Don't think about the breath. Just pay attention. Settle with that clear alertness. Thank you for your practice.